the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the war against terrorism, two extraordinarily vexing matters. We're very fortunate that someone whose career at the State Department has been immersed in these matters and someone who continues as president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace continues to pursue these questions. And perplexed as we may be, we look forward to gaining in lucidity and understanding this evening. Ambassador Wilcox is a graduate of Williams College and Stanford Law. Interestingly, he taught school in Sierra Leone after graduating. He spent 3 years as a lawyer in Denver before joining the State Department in 1966. He was stationed originally in the early career in Laos, in Indonesia, in Bangladesh, and his last overseas assignment was as chief of mission in Jerusalem. And he's had interesting and major assignments at the State Department as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, as Principal Deputy Assistant for Intelligence and Research, and then served as our Ambassador at Large and Coordinator for Counterterrorism. So the background he brings is absolutely apropos. We look forward to being informed. It's my enormous pleasure to present to you Ambassador Wilcox.
Thank you, Frank, and thank all of you for inviting me to Baltimore. It's an extraordinary place. I live just 50 miles away, and this marvelous harbor and the beautiful architecture is really stunning. So congratulate you. I'll have to come more often. Believe it or not, I'm going to talk about various things, but I'm even going to venture how we can win in Israel and Palestine. Now, that will surprise you all because the image of this conflict in our country is that it's an intractable one. It's a struggle between violent, angry, crazy people who love violence, who never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, and who simply cannot make peace. I don't believe that, but surely it is an extraordinarily difficult problem that has not yielded to a solution for the past 60 years. There have been 6 wars, recurrent bloodshed. In recent years, it's descended to its lowest level of strife after a 10-year period of hope and expectation. Now there is a slight glimmer of hope on the horizon with the election of President Mahmoud Abbas of Palestine, a man who's committed to nonviolence and negotiations, and the first historic withdrawal of the State of Israel from settlements in Gaza. And those two events, in the eyes of optimists, have combined to promise steady progress toward peace. I wouldn't get your hopes up. I think those expectations are exaggerated. The core conflict continues. In recent days, we have seen a new rise of violence, mutual violence, and unless there is further diplomatic intervention, which thus far has been lacking, I foresee a reversion to a further armed conflict. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about why it's been so difficult. Some say it's a religious conflict. There is a religious element to it, but essentially this is a struggle between two people who have deep claims to the same land. It's a question of how they can coexist in this land. Now, as the conflict deepens, there are religious fanatics on both sides. And once this becomes a pure religious conflict, there will be no solution because religious fanatics, as you know, believe they have a monopoly on truth and that they only speak to God. Well, a solution does exist. It's well known now that this land must be divided into 2 states so these 2 communities can live side by side at peace. Most of the Israelis, most of the Palestinians are fed up with violence. Both peoples have, according to public opinion polls, showed that they at least intellectually, believe there is a way out. Both peoples long for stronger American diplomatic leadership. The question is now, will our country seize this new opportunity? Well, to begin with, you need to go back and review some history. This is a history of two historic tragedies. The Jewish people who suffered 2 millennia of persecution, of second-class citizenship, of vicious anti-Semitism, and it never ended. In the late 19th century, when other peoples were seeking supporting national movements, Jewish nationalism was born, Zionism. And the aim of Zionism was to create a home for the Jewish people in their ancient homeland of Palestine, where they could live as normal people at peace with the rest of the world, where they could fulfill their ancient aspirations to be a light unto nations. The British supported them. There would be no state of Israel. Zionism would just be a footnote in history. Had it not been for British tutelage, the British saw a Jewish homeland in the Middle East as a strategic anchor for their plans to replace Ottoman Turkey as the hegemon in the Arab and Muslim world. And so, under British tutelage, with the support of the Balfour Declaration, Jewish immigrants from Europe began to go to Palestine. The British foolishly assumed they would get along fine, but there was violence and conflict from the very beginning. The Palestinian indigenous people saw the Jews as just another Western crusader invasion determined to take their land and dominate them. There was violence, 2 decades of violence, and then came World War II and the Holocaust. It was the Holocaust, essentially, which created the State of Israel. Even with British support, even with the creation of a kind of proto-state in the 20s and 30s, Israel would not have succeeded had it not been for the Holocaust, because for more and more Jews, a state of their own, a refuge where they could live safely, became an imperative. For some, a matter of survival. They were determined. And there was a great war when the British threw up their hands and abandoned Palestine. The Jews won the war with a vastly superior army, and they declared their independence, and the world supported them. It was a moment of triumph for the Jewish people, a moment of redemption after centuries of suffering of anti-Semitism. Now they were a free people in a land of their own. What is less well known is that this was accompanied by a tragedy, the second tragedy, the tragedy of the Palestinian people, 750,000 of whom were driven from their lands and homes, or who left for fear of their lives. So we have at this moment in history this curious juxtaposition of the Jews and the Arabs, both of whom experienced tragedies of different kinds, but it gives it a particular poignancy, a moral complexity, and it requires that we recognize that this is a conflict involving 2 victims. And in order to solve it, we have to appreciate their respective suffering. We have to have empathy and respect for both peoples. We have not always done that, alas. Both sides, unfortunately, from the very beginning, did not recognize the history, the suffering of the others. They contrived nationalistic myths. They denied that the other side had any equities, any justice. They demonized each other. They engaged in vicious propaganda, partisanship, and the struggle from the very beginning was deeply polarized. Unfortunately, this polarization was exported around the world, especially to our country, and we took sides. For decades, we could not have an open, objective discourse about this problem. We took sides with the Israelis. We knew nothing of the Palestinians. And my urgent advice to Americans is that we mustn't take sides. Let's take sides with the partisans of peace. If we decide that we are going to support the claims of the Israelis exclusively or the Palestinians exclusively, we become part of the problem. Let's empathize and support both. They deserve it, they need it, and unless we do, they're not going to sort this out themselves. This is not a zero-sum game. This is a game that can be won for both sides by an equitable division of the land, an end of the Israeli occupation, the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state. Without that, there can be no peace nor security for Israel. Israel's fundamental need is the preservation of a Jewish democratic state at peace with security. Palestinians' fundamental need is liberation, dignity, in a state of their own, and to be rescued from an onerous occupation and dispossession. These two things are absolutely independent. One cannot happen without the other. A friend of mine, M.J. Rosenberg of the Israel Policy Council, has put it very well. He said, if you are pro-Israel, then you must be pro-Palestine, and vice versa. I like that phrase. I think that sums up where we, as Americans, ought to be on this conflict. Well, we haven't been, and the conflict has festered for some 57 years now. Both sides have missed many opportunities. Extremists and ideologues and fanatics on both sides have tended to hold the initiative, and the United States, alas, has been rather timid and partisan. We've had some modest successes, but by and large, our diplomacy, I'm afraid, has been weak. Our self-appointed role, indeed the role that only we can play as a good faith, honest broker and intermediary, has been complicated by the fact that we have developed a kind of quasi-alliance with the State of Israel. This is based on our culture, our tradition as a people who, at least in the past, identified ourselves as a people of Judeo-Christian culture, based on the Bible, the Old Testament, the emotional quality of the Holy Land. We have had no similar affinity for the Arabs nor the Muslims. Indeed, for most of our history, we've tended to regard them with fear and suspicion. The State of Israel developed a brilliant diplomatic service. They have promoted masterful information propaganda programs. The Palestinians and the Arabs have not done this. And Americans, indeed, grew even more skeptical and suspicious of the Palestinians because of terrorism, which angered and frightened Americans. The watershed in this conflict, which made it more intractable, was the 1967 war, when after a great victory, which Israel occupied the Sinai Desert, the Syrian Golan Heights, and the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, they made a fateful mistake. There was an argument. The diplomats, the liberals in Israel said, we must not dominate another people. We must not occupy the Palestinians permanently. The army, on the contrary, said this is more land. It provides a security buffer. And the army combined, supported, made common cause with a minority group of Israeli Jews who believed in a new and very unconventional strain of Judaism, which preached that it was the duty of the Jewish people to recover the land that God had given Abraham, and that in doing so, they would bring forth the Jewish Messiah. This kind of Messianic Judaism is very powerful. It's fanatic. It is not traditional Judaism. It places a premium on the land. It holds no value, nor does it recognize the other people who live on land. This is a powerful movement. It's still a minority movement, but it's had extraordinary success in Israeli politics. And over these many years since 1967, they have succeeded in building Israeli settlements with support from both Israeli parties throughout the West Bank. There are now some 240,000 Israeli settlers living in the West Bank, some 100,000 in East Jerusalem. The purpose of this was to create what they call facts on the ground in an effort to prevent the divestiture of this land to the Palestinians and a Palestinian state. It was a fateful step. It was done over the argument of liberals and scholars and historians who believed that this would bring a disaster upon Israel. While that disaster has not fully materialized, Israel is now in deep trouble because of this massive intervention of Israeli settlement into what the Palestinians regard as their territory, into what remained of the Palestinian lands after the War of 48. So remember that centrality of the settlement issue. Now, in the 1980s, after many wars, liberal, progressive, peace-minded thinkers began to emerge in both Israeli and Palestinian politics. And they began to advocate peace, recognizing that constant warfare had failed. It had cost both sides dearly, that there could never be a victor through military power, and that they needed to make a deal. The Palestinians, indeed, in 1988, abandoned their doctrine of armed struggle. The PLO said, we will accept peace with Israel, recognize Israel, we will forswear violence, and we will have two states. The Israeli were a bit slower, but there was a comparable peace movement. After the first Gulf War and the fall of the Soviet Union, George H.W. Bush and Jim Baker saw an opportunity here to finally seize this issue and deal with it far more decisively than anyone had in the past. And they, by very assertive diplomacy, finally got the Israelis and the Palestinians to sit down at the Madrid conference in 1991. The concept was that after this initial meeting, there would be negotiations between the two sides, and they would make peace. It didn't work. Bush and Baker were diverted for domestic reasons. But by then, Israeli and Palestinian leaders understood that something good was going on. And so secretly, agents of Yasser Arafat and the new Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, negotiated in Oslo and brought forth the Oslo Declaration of Peace in 1993. The Oslo Declaration fundamentally was a commitment to recognize each other. Zionism and Palestinian nationalism finally came to terms with each other and were committed to negotiations. We thought it was the beginning of the end, but it was a terrible failure. We didn't know that at the time. It was a great thrill to see Arafat and Rabin shaking hands on the White House lawn on that sunny August afternoon in 1993. But as we know, it's now turned to ashes. After 7 years of fitful negotiations, 8 years, the two parties reverted to terrible violence. Now, there are lessons that we need to learn from the Oslo process. The main lesson is that you're not going to make peace through a process, simply a process of sitting down together. There will not be peace in this conflict until both sides share a common vision of what the outcome is going to be. The Israelis and the Palestinians had a very different vision of what Oslo was to achieve. The Israelis believed that as the occupying power, vastly more powerful, they could continue to occupy large parts of the West Bank, all of East Jerusalem. The Palestinians would have to take more or less what they were offered. The Palestinians had a different view. They said, we have given up 78% of our former homeland. We recognize Israel within the 67 borders. We want the West Bank and Gaza as our state and East Jerusalem as our capital. So these are widely different views because there wasn't any agreement in the beginning about the outcome. The second lesson is that the idea that you can build confidence simply through talks in a step-by-step process doesn't work. It doesn't work particularly in societies like Israeli and Palestinian society, where there are ideologues, extremists, and fanatics who never accepted the idea of peace and were determined to do everything to bring it down. They did. During this period, the settlement movement in the West Bank doubled the population from 100,000 to 200,000. Now, both Israeli parties contributed to this. Palestinians who promised to cease violence in the Oslo Declaration could not control fanatic Palestinian elements who resumed violence. There was also Jewish violence and terrorism. The army continued to occupy the large part of the West Bank and to treat the Palestinians as occupied people. Over time, both the Israelis and the Palestinians lost confidence in peace. The Palestinians began terrible, I should say, minority extremist Palestinian elements carried out terrible suicide bombings in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and other Israeli cities. The Israelis continued building settlements in crucial areas, demolishing homes, dispossessing Palestinians. So both sides lost hope. Violence grew. It was spontaneous violence. Neither the Israeli leadership nor the Palestinian leadership had the vision to rise above this and salvage the process, and the United States throughout the period simply served the role as passing information back and forth. We were not a genuine mediator. We played a very, very modest role. Madeleine Albright once said, "Our role in this process is to be a handmaiden to the parties." I don't think Henry Kissinger would have described himself as a handmaiden. We kept saying in Washington, well, we can't want peace more than the parties themselves, as if the U.S. had no interests of its own. So we did very little until the very end, when Bill Clinton, urged by Ehud Barak to hold a summit, agreed. A last gasp effort to salvage this process in the face of rising violence and despair on both sides. Clinton realized that the parties were not ready, yet he decided to do this at the request of Barak. He went to Arafat and said, Yasser, we've got to have a summit. Arafat said, Mr. President, you mustn't do this. We are not ready. The Israelis are not ready. And I fear that it's going to founder, and you're going to blame me. Bill Clinton said, don't worry, Yasser, everything will be great. Sure enough, it failed. And everyone blamed Arafat and the Palestinians. Now, to be sure, the Palestinian and Arafat bear a portion of the blame for the crash of the Camp David summit, but so did Ehud Barak, and so did Bill Clinton. We were unprepared. The Israelis were unprepared. There were no notes. There were no maps. This was a very sloppy, ill-organized process. Barak never met with Arafat at Camp David except for an initial courtesy call. He refused to negotiate face-to-face and it seems almost consciously tried to humiliate Arafat. Arafat sat there like a stone figure. He didn't respond to initiatives and proposals. He didn't really get into the negotiations. It failed after over 2 weeks, and violence continued to grow when Ariel Sharon made his fateful visit to the Temple Mount, also known as the Haram al-Sharif, the site of the two holy mosques. So the fat was in the fire. There were last-ditch efforts to salvage this with further negotiations, and indeed, in November, Bill Clinton came up with something called the Clinton Parameters. For the first time in history, a U.S. president defined a policy. Now, it was rather vague. It was an outline, but he took positions on these vital issues of borders, settlements, Jerusalem, and refugees. No American president had had the courage to do that in the past. So we should applaud Clinton for doing that. But it was much too late. He should have done it 6 or 8 years earlier. Aaron Miller, the deputy American administrator under Ambassador Dennis Ross, said in an op-ed page not long ago in the Washington Post that we failed in the Oslo process. And one reason why we failed is that too often we saw our role as being the lawyer for the Israelis. That's a scathing indictment of the way we dealt with this, but I fear it is true, having lived through it and watched it closely myself. It was only normal that the Israelis, being the occupying power, vastly stronger than the Palestinians, would take advantage of this, and they did. In this situation, it behooved the United States to serve as a real mediator, to weigh in, to try to create some balance. We didn't do this. Now, the outcome, I should mention that there was one further final negotiation in January 2000 when 2001 at Taba in Egypt, where Israeli and Palestinian negotiators actually went much further than either the Camp David plan nor the Taba plan. But it was too late. There was a political retreat on both sides, and Ariel Sharon, the architect of the settlement movement, a man who had opposed all Israeli peace agreements, a man who had always believed in the use of force to resolve disputes, became the new Israeli prime minister. Now, we still hear people say, well, it's still the fault of the Palestinians. Arafat refused a generous offer. It was quite generous by Israeli standards. They went much further at Camp David than they ever had. But it would have produced 3 disconnected enclaves, not a viable Palestinian state. The fact that Arafat did not move to stop the violence, which had erupted spontaneously, is a severe indictment of Yasser Arafat. He could have done more to stop the violence. He didn't. He thought it would improve his negotiating leverage. It is not true, in my view, that Arafat did this because he basically was never committed to peace and he decided to return to armed struggle and the destruction of Israel. That is what Ariel Sharon told the Israeli public in the face of growing Palestinian violence and terror, and that's what they believed, and they voted Sharon in. A very, very different kind of Israeli leader, and Sharon said, I'm going to rescue you from this violence. We're going to restore security. We're going to crack down on the Palestinians, and he did with massive force. The fledgling Palestinian Authority was virtually destroyed. Israeli forces reoccupied the West Bank and Gaza, yet it did not stop the violence. It provoked further violence. Finally, after 3 years, the Israeli public was growing weary of this. Sharon was losing in the polls. Meanwhile, a group of Israeli and Palestinian peacemakers who had been active in the 90s, who were now in private life, decided to continue a kind of virtual negotiation. And they came up with a kind of virtual peace treaty called the Geneva Accord, which spelled it out, which dealt with all of these final status issues of Jerusalem, settlements, borders, security, and refugees in a way that met the fundamental needs of both peoples. This was a demonstration that there is a way out, that leading distinguished Israelis and Palestinians can do it. Sharon described the Geneva Accord as treason, and it was largely ignored in Washington. Sharon needed to do something to restore his public support, so he came up with what he called his disengagement plan. Essentially, withdrawal from all settlements in Gaza, and the building of a massive wall or barrier separating Palestinians from Israelis. Now, the United States during this four-year period was sporadically involved, but never decisively. The president, to his credit, said early in his administration that we support a viable and contiguous Palestinian state. But he didn't spell out what that meant. He urged the withdrawal of Israeli forces and an end to settlements, but Sharon ignored him, and the president didn't press Sharon. The president then came up with something called the roadmap, together with the Russians, the UN, and the European Union, which was a kind of modified Oslo process, but it did describe the destination, a viable, contiguous Palestinian state. Unfortunately, the president did not press the roadmap. The two initial requirements were that the Palestinians would stop the violence and rein in their armed militias, and that the Israelis would stop settlement building. Neither thing happened. Both sides said the other had to act first. The U.S. did not crack the whip. And so the violence continued. Finally, the parties reached a kind of ceasefire, and Sharon did fulfill his promise to withdraw from Gaza. This was a historic move. Some say that it's the beginning of the end of the settlement movement. I think they're right. The question is, how long will it take? Sharon promoted this as a peacemaking initiative, yet Sharon's real intention, while withdrawing from Gaza, is to consolidate Israeli control in the West Bank. And indeed, he is doing so by rapidly accelerating the building of settlements, by building Israeli-only roads. His vision of what he now acknowledges may be a Palestinian state is a series of enclaves surrounded by Israeli forces, settlements, and roads. Not a formula for peace, indeed a formula for continued violence. He believes that this can be done by building a massive barrier and wall, and hundreds of kilometers of that wall have already been built. The wall is not built, however, on the 1967 armistice line. It is built deeply into the West Bank in a way that confiscates further Palestinian land and ensures that there could not be a viable, contiguous Palestinian state. Well, the Gaza disengagement and the election of Mahmoud Abbas did offer an opening. Many thought that the Palestinians could set an example by a peaceful control in Gaza and economic development there, and that would reassure the Israeli public. But it would require help from Israel. Thus far, according to James Wilkinson, the president's envoy for Gaza, very little has happened. Although the settlements have been shut down, the Israeli forces have left, but Gaza is still a kind of large prison that lacks vital access for goods and services and trade to the West Bank and to the rest of the world. So the results thus far from the Gaza disengagement have been quite disappointing, and in the meantime, the ceasefire has begun to crumble with new suicide bombings, new very, very tough Israeli military retaliations, and a resumption of assassination by Israeli forces of Palestinian militant suspects. So the situation is fraught with growing danger, and I don't believe that it can be salvaged by the parties themselves. They have shown repeatedly, because of their internal political divisions, because of the determination of the fanatics and the ideologues, the militants on both sides, they cannot do it themselves. Moreover, Sharon doesn't want a mutually agreed agreement. Sharon wants to do it his own way, unilaterally, and his vision is an imposed peace in which the Palestinians would more or less surrender to this kind of ersatz, fragmented Palestinian entity. They won't do that. His plan is a recipe for violence. Sharon's unwillingness to cooperate with Mahmoud Abbas is weakening him, and he faces elections next January in the Palestinian parliament, and his party will be opposed by the Islamist Hamas group, which has not committed itself to peace and recognition of Israel. Well, it's a dismal situation. What can be done? I think it can be salvaged. I think that if the United States, with the support of the UN and the European Union, would engage more actively on behalf of both the Israelis and the Palestinians, that we could turn this situation around. That is not easy to do, given the skill and the determination of Ariel Sharon, given the weakness of Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian leadership apparatus. Well, how would this happen? What should the U.S. do? I think if the U.S. had a policy, had a vision of what peace should mean for both peoples, and if it spelled this out in a dramatic American peace initiative, I think it would have a galvanizing effect on politics in both Israel and Palestine. I think if we said, we know that both of you have suffered terribly, we know that you have been through 15 years of negotiations, we know that there are solutions to all these problems and that you yourselves have worked these out, and we endorse these, and here is the Bush plan for peace. And we are committed to see this through. I'm appointing a senior envoy. I want to work with both parties. I want to promise and ensure that Israelis can live at peace, free of terrorism and insecurity. I want to assure the Palestinians that they're going to be liberated, that they will no longer suffer humiliation, indignity, and occupation. I think that would have a dramatic effect on politics in those two societies, and I believe that their leaders ultimately would have to respond. I think it would be supported by growing majorities on both sides. I think it would marginalize the extremists, and I think their leaders ultimately would have to go along, and if they didn't, they would be replaced. I see no other way to do it. I'm not suggesting that we impose this. We can't. We need to work with the people in both societies so that they themselves can bring their leaders to do the right things. Now, it's not impossible. It will require great skill and investment of time and energy and creativity. Why should we do it? Not just out of altruism, but altruism plays a part in it. We have called ourselves the best friend and ally of the State of Israel. If we really are, do we want to indulge them in self-destructive policies of occupation, a disposition that dooms them to perpetual conflict? We have an obligation to the Palestinians, too. We believe in justice, democracy, self-determination, and human rights. They deserve these things just as other people do. But most of all, we owe it to ourselves, because if there's any conflict that creates danger to the United States, admittedly, the Iraq conflict is a very dangerous one, but people who used to say the road to peace in the Middle East lies through Baghdad, I think now have reconsidered. The road to peace lies through Jerusalem. And if the United States would step up to the plate with a wise, empathetic plan that addressed the basic needs of both of these people, if we treated them as equals and kept at it, I think they would respond and do the right thing. These are not crazy, fanatic people. They're afraid. They've been brainwashed by propaganda. They've been scared to death of terrorism and of military actions on the other side. They would grasp and rally to an American proposal, and I think our own public would too. Now, maybe you think that's a stretch. There is a kind of well-worn belief in Washington that real active American diplomacy in this conflict is the third rail of American politics. People say you can't do it because of the Jewish lobby. I think that's nonsense. They say you can't do it because of the Christian right. That's more nonsense. I think the American public are smart people. I think we as a society would like to see this problem solved in a way that does justice to both peoples, I think the American Jewish community would respond positively if this were properly done. I think our politicians have been much too timid, and they have hurt the United States in the process. Are they going to do it? I don't know. When President Abbas was here 2 weeks ago, President Bush said, well, I'm not sure this is going to be done during my second term. I was disappointed to hear that. Just a year ago, he said, I'm going to invest new capital in this. I'm going to go for broke, and we're going to solve this problem. Now, needless to say, the president is kind of up to his ears in alligators at the moment. But if he's looking for another initiative, he made a smart initiative today talking about avian flu. I think the right kind of smart American initiative to address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict could be a political plus if it were done properly, and could help redeem the president's sagging polls, his reputation for leadership in foreign affairs. It would do a great service to our country. It would do an enormous service to those suffering Israelis and Palestinians. Now, let me turn for a moment to the problem of terrorism. It's a complex thing. It is a problem that has many manifestations. Terrorism is essentially the weapon of the weak that is used to achieve political goals, all kinds of goals, good and bad. Terrorism can be reduced. It can never be completely solved. It's been around from time immemorial. But it can be reduced if we spend more time addressing not just the symptoms, but the causes. And we have made a mistake, I think, in recent years after 9/11 in assuming that we could go out and destroy the terrorists and that would solve the problem of terrorism. That the primary instrument of counterterrorism should be our military forces. To be sure, military forces are needed in some cases, but in rare cases. Effective counterterrorism means effective diplomacy, effective policies, careful, wise analysis of the reasons for conflict, the reasons why people resort to heinous violence on terror, and how perhaps those causes could be addressed, ameliorated, if not solved entirely. No problem has generated more hatred and disrespect for the United States than the long-festering Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It creates an environment in the Middle East where radicals, fanatics, people who hate the United States can prosper. It reduces the incentive of governments and of publics there to move against the terrorists, to crack down on them, to marginalize them, to disgrace them. And so as a weapon of anti-terrorism, the resolution of or at least a genuine effort to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is critically important. That, of course, is not the only problem in the Middle East. It's not the only source of terrorism. There are many others. But we need a more thoughtful approach dealing not just with the symptoms. Mind you, we have to deal with symptoms. We have to go after terrorists, put them in jail, arrest them, indeed, sometimes even kill them. But that's not nearly enough. If we do this successfully but do nothing else, another crop of terrorists will emerge in their wake, and that's exactly what is happening today. Well, I talked a lot, but I'd be delighted to answer your questions and hear your comments.
Thank you very much. The question is, what would you estimate the Palestinians would accept as a state?
Both of these societies are very divided. Both societies are divided. There is an element in Israel that wants it all, that wants the settlements, wants to dispossess, if not drive out, the Palestinians. That's a minority. There is an element in Palestinian society which has not abandoned its dream of destroying Israel, driving the Jews into the sea. That too is a minority. Those minorities thrive if there is not a political process to address the problem. The Palestinian leadership, President Abbas, has said, we want a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem, where there are 200,000 Palestinians, which is the cultural, political, economic capital of Palestine. The one issue which remains ambivalent is the so-called right of return. There are Palestinians, I think, on the extreme end of the spectrum who say, we have a right to go back to our homes and lands in Israel that we lost in 1948. They're wrong. Perhaps there is some, one can make a case in international law, but that can never happen. There will never be peace if the Palestinians demand a right to go back, reclaim all that they lost in 1948. Otherwise, you'd have a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and you'd have a Palestinian state in Israel. That's not a solution. The wise Palestinians recognize this. There have been lots of talks about how to solve the refugee problem in a more symbolic way. The Palestinians would return to the Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. That's what their leadership wants. Public opinion shows that most of their people would accept that. Now, there'll have to be some border rectifications. It won't be easy, but the solution is out there, and the wise people who studied it on both sides recognize it's there.
What thought has been given by both sides to minority rights in both communities?
The liberal and centrist part of the Israeli spectrum advocates and supports equal rights for the Arab citizens of Israel in the context of a Jewish state. They do not abandon the idea of a Jewish state. There are civil society organizations, Jewish Arab organizations inside Israel that are working to restore civil liberty, equality for Arab Israelis. And there's some very good ones, and there's quite a movement going on. That will not happen until the larger issue of Israeli-Palestinian issues is solved in a final status peace agreement. I predict that once there is such an agreement, then the Israelis will turn to the problem of perfecting their relations between Jews and Arabs. I can understand why it hasn't happened. Many Israelis, Jews, regard their Arabs as a kind of fifth column, and the continued failure to liberate the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza has alienated Israeli Arabs. But that problem, too, is soluble. With respect to the Palestinians, they have said that if Jews would like to live as citizens of Palestine in the new state of Palestine, they are welcome to. But they will not accept them as an extraterritorial presence under Israeli governance.
Is there a role for China in this process?
You know, I haven't given any thought to that. China is a great power. China has a stake in a stable, prosperous Middle East. China relies heavily on Middle East oil to fuel its growing economy. The Chinese have developed a very, very capable diplomatic service. They have lots of Middle East experts. So China will not be a central player, but they'll certainly take a keen interest in this. I think the Chinese will not press for rapid democratization of Arab states. They'll take a more kind of cynical and pragmatic view. But sure, they're a player, and their voice will be heard.
Why haven't the French and the British been more assertive in their diplomacy?
I used to get a lot of barbs from my British diplomatic colleagues who said, you Americans are really making a mess in the Middle East. And of course, the British were originally responsible for all of this. The British and the French are not great powers. They don't have the weight of the relationship with the Israelis, nor the Palestinians. Only the U.S. can play this role. I agree, sometimes the the British and the French have made it harder for the United States. Their help is needed. They have been helpful to the extent of, with their European Union colleagues, providing generous aid to the Palestinians, which the Palestinians badly need. And the French and the British, to their credit, have fought the battle against anti-Semitism in their own countries, which I fear may be rising again, largely as a consequence of this continuing conflict.
You're asked to comment on Elaine Burke's plan, which is to place Mr. Mubarak, because he hates both sides, in as mediator.
First, the United Nations, they do have a role to play. I believe that we should put aside our adversarial relationship with the United Nations. We have been able to work very successfully with the UN at times during our history in a way that has enhanced American interests. I think the UN is a kind of easy, convenient whipping boy, but in fact, the UN is critically important. We can use it to our advantage, and basically our foreign policy ought to be a policy of alliance and cooperation with others that multiplies our strength. If we go it alone, we weaken ourselves. Now, the UN isn't going to take the lead on this. They can't, but they can help. The Egyptians, in fact, have been helpful in working with Palestinian factions to help bring about and to preserve a ceasefire. Mubarak does not have the weight or the authority, however, to play the role that the United States plays. You're right that he doesn't like the Palestinians, he doesn't like the Israelis. He's an autocrat who is afraid of his own shadow, as most of these Middle Eastern autocrats are. But they have played a constructive role in a small way in Gaza to try to help the Palestinians restore calm and to work with them on a critical border crossing issue between Gaza and Egypt.
The observation is that mullahs and extremists have exploited the Palestinian problem, and why isn't there a greater sense of urgency about this in the United States?
You're quite right that the Palestinian issue has been exploited and manipulated by extremist Muslim religious leaders and by Arab politicians. That does not mean that this is not an important problem. It is an important problem. The anxiety, the fear, the dislike of the United States for our perceived policy of one-sidedness is widely shared throughout Arab and Muslim society, irrespective of what the extremist religious figures say. And let me point out that also there are extremist religious figures in Israel. There are rabbis who call for the destruction of the Palestinians, who do not recognize that they have any rights. They are not rabbis who are speaking for Judaism any more than these mullahs are speaking for Islam, but they are people who are distorting and perverting religion for a political cause, and they're part of the problem.
Would you comment upon the phenomenon of anti-Israeli policy and intentions on the part of Iran and other entities, and perhaps the bias against Israel on the part of the United Nations and Europe as well? In short, a picture of the anti-Israeli pattern.
There has been a pattern over the years of states, especially Arab states, ganging up with other third world countries against Israel in the United Nations. That's true, in the General Assembly. Not in the Security Council, where the U.S. has the veto. I think this, in part, this was political exploitation. In part, it was frustration over the absence of any other political process to resolve this conflict, which caused such a emotion and a grievance among their own people. I said the UN could be helpful. There are many UN specialized agencies which provide aid, technical support, assistance of all kinds, and President Bush has included Kofi Annan and a member of this quartet, together with the European Union and the Russians. The U.S. has to take the lead, not the EU or the UN. Now, as for the Palestinian Covenant, the Palestinian Covenant was abolished. The covenant refers to language in the founding documents of the PLO, which call for the destruction of Israel. That language has been deleted, and the deletion has been voted upon and approved by the Palestinian National Congress. It was done. It was superseded by the Palestinian Declaration in 1988, in which they recognized Israel agreed to make peace and abandon violence. It was done again at the request of Prime Minister Netanyahu. So the covenant is gone. It is no longer the governing document of the Palestinians, and the Palestinian leadership has agreed to make peace on the basis of two states and on the basis of nonviolence.
Would you comment upon the impact of the Cold War rivalry on the situation?
That's a very, very good point to make. During the Cold War, we supported Israeli governments and Israeli policies, not only because of this subjective religious, cultural, historical bond, but because we saw the Israeli armed forces, the most capable military forces in the Middle East, as a potential ally against what we feared might be a Soviet military invasion of the Middle East. I always thought this fear was exaggerated. There's never any evidence from intelligence that the Soviets were going to send their armies into the Middle East. Now, admittedly, they sent them into Afghanistan, and they came a cropper there. But there was a kind of political struggle between the West and the communist Soviet Union to win the hearts and minds of the Arab peoples, the Arab people. Now, if the U.S. had wanted to be cynical about this, we would have thrown the Israelis overboard, because there are a lot more Arabs in the Middle East than there are Israelis. We didn't do that, and we shouldn't have. But there was this notion at the time that yet another reason for this tight U.S.-Israeli bond was a strategic military bond. That's gone by the wayside now, as the Soviet Union has disappeared.
I regret that our time has been exhausted, but we thank you for what was a thoroughly educating evening.